Welcome to Innovating with Scott Amyx. I'm your host, Scott, and today I'm joined by Will Herman, who is an entrepreneur, active investor, corporate director, startup mentor, and the author of the Startup Playbook. Welcome, Will.
Great to see you, Scott. Thanks so much for having me on.
All right. So let's first start with your upbringing. You mentioned that your upbringing really kind of sparked your interest in technology. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, it's funny. I actually grew up in a family where there was not an entrepreneurial word spoken. In fact, my father was a socialist, and he believed the idea of making money from people was abhorrent. He was a doctor who gave away all of his services, but somehow I became the black sheep of the family, and from earliest days, took apart every gadget and component in our house. And then ultimately went to engineering school, much to the chagrin of my parents, certainly my father. And that was sort of the beginning for me. I needed to know how things work, and that ultimately led me to technology.
That is really interesting. I don't think that anybody would have assumed that you came from a kind of a socialistic upbringing. But I have to ask you, because I've actually remember interviewing somebody from South America, and his family were very similar, but yet what happened for him was that he actually retained some of those values while still being able to focus on free markets and his entrepreneurship. So I'm just curious to see how you've kind of reconciled that.
Well, wow, that's a really good point. I think you're going to have me dig deep in my psyche here. I think I'm a very empathetic person. I certainly understand the idea of how socialism creates great community, and ultimately that's key to my management style and my company building style. That I use those fundamentals in how to bring people together, how to work through organizational behavioral issues, and ultimately organizational growth.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Is that when we think about socialism, it's not just a political economic model, but it's also a human and societal model. So it's interesting to see that you have that empathy, of course, translating to emotional intelligence that you share with the co-founders of some of these startups, as well as their employees and key management as well.
I think so. Yeah.
Let's go back to your entrepreneurial journey early on. After getting your degree, you were a programmer, and then eventually became a VP of engineering for many years of View Logic Systems in the 80s and early 90s. You eventually became president and CEO. And then you started to launch a string of startups. But let me just pause there and tell us about that journey up to kind of the mid-90s.
So I think it's worth a step back. I actually I went to college, went to engineering school, and then my second year in, I quit school because I got a summer job with a startup, which was my indoctrination into startups. I didn't even know that startups existed before that time. And at the end of the summer, they offered me a full-time job. I think I was making like $16,000 a year in the that was the late 70s, and I had a blast. I learned so much. Everything moved very fast. The company went bankrupt after 18 months, and that was my indoctrination into failed startups, which happened soon after my indoctrination into startups in general. But it was such a great experience that it made me want to do more. In fact, I went off and started my own company right after that, which also failed in about 18 months. My great lesson in cash flow. I had a lot of business, but just couldn't afford to keep running the company because I didn't manage cash flow. And then I ran away and I worked for a big company and had a blast there at Digital Equipment Corporation in the early 80s. And that's where I met my co-founders for ViewLogic Systems. And as you mentioned, where I was VP of engineering there. we had a great run. We about 7 years. We took the company public. Did quite well. Went public in the early '90s, and actually at that time I left ViewLogic and I started a couple of other companies. Moved from the East Coast to the West Coast. Started a couple of other companies. One of those went public, and the other one was strangely acquired back by ViewLogic, starting the great circular. I don't know, the circular path of my career.
Yep. So I just, for those that are maybe didn't quite live through some of those eras, I just want to make sure we kind of stew on this a little bit more, is that, when we think about the 1970s, we're really talking about the Hewlett-Packard. So the startup landscape, or what we consider Silicon Valley, was very different. And certainly the kinds of investment tranche back then was very, very different as well. So tell us about kind of the 70s, 80s, and then, the IPOs that you were involved. How much of that do you think was attributed to kind of the blue ocean effect and of course, the correlation to the dot-com? And could we have replicated that success at a different time period?
All great questions. I mean, to sort of point things out, you mentioned the entrepreneurial and venture capital community were a lot different. At ViewLogic, our first investment, and this is institutional investment, not angel investment, which almost didn't exist at the time, was for $50,000, and the second 25 was actually contingent on us delivering some product. So the big money that we see now, $1 million seed rounds, $2 million seed rounds with $8 million pre-money valuations, not a thing. Just was not a thing. I mean, there were very few venture capitalists. There was very few money in the venture capital, very little money in the venture capital marketplaces. So a lot different. And when we went public, that was in 1991, the valuations were a lot different. There were no unicorns. There was no multiples like that. The idea of a 15x forward 12 revenue, that valuation just didn't exist. Your valuations were almost entirely based on profits, and the numbers were still like 15 to 25x based on your profit. So we just didn't see the valuation criteria, the company size criteria. We saw companies that were based on profit rather than growth. An entirely different market during that time.
But that changed, right? Because after your exits, now you're starting to get into kind of the late 90s, and you're at the height of the dot-com. And by then, I think you had pretty much switched hats to becoming a full-time investor. Is that correct? What were you seeing at that point?
So, sorry, no, I didn't become a full-time investor till the early 2000s, okay. After the bust. In the late 90s, it did start to change a little bit. We sold ViewLogic in 1997, and then bought it back a year later at a fraction of its price, and doing a venture-backed management buyout. And then actually by the early 2000s, we had taken it public again, and sold it one more time. At the beginning of the 2000s. So it was, the company did great during the whole time, but there was a lot of financial transactions. That kind of thing also doesn't happen very often anymore, but certainly a lot of acquisitions still happening, more than happened then. We did a little more financial engineering than most, and we created a lot of value for our shareholders. But to your point, in the early 2000s, things changed quite a bit. Mm-hmm. It's after the dot-com bust, everybody settled in, and since then we've seen the growth, other than a few skips market-wise, for the last 20 years.
Yeah. So tell us about the height of the dot-com, and then the bust, and then. Like I said, you mentioned you started to become more of an investor after the bust. what was that like? Because I remember during the dot-com, there was just like exuberance and this momentum couldn't be stopped. And it seemed like everyone was having a party every other day. And then
Right.
the dot-com happened. I mean, the bust happened. What was that like? And how did the startups that I ended up actually surviving have a certain degree of management and fiscal discipline that perhaps maybe those that then survived had? And how do we actually then apply that to what's happening today?
Yeah, it's you know I don't even know where to start there. It was an interesting time. It was certainly very messy. I think sort of similar to what we've seen in the last few years. There was plenty of money, as you say, plenty of exuberance. Really ridiculous amounts of money being spent. I mean, the Super Bowl had ads for startup companies. And it was chock full of ads for startup companies because there was so much money in the water. Venture capitalists were just piling money into companies. I mean, the internet was still relatively new in terms of its commercial basis. Excuse me, maybe, closing on actually less than 10 years old at the time. And the web was even newer, of course. And so people thought this was the next big thing, the next sliced bread, and people were piling on like crazy and being ridiculous about it. Also, the companies weren't being analyzed for profit or for growth. They were all analyzed for promise. So that really led to the bust in 2001, and that straightened things out quite a bit. People were more cautious. Money was much tighter. Corporate governance was tighter. Startup boards and small company boards became much better. And that's sort of when I entered it. And I'm sort of an old school guy that way. And when I joined company boards, I certainly wasn't single-handedly involved in any change here. But we all buttoned down much more. And at the time, money was much harder to get. Companies were much harder to grow. You had to prove yourself. Real profit mattered. But as you said, over time, we've loosened up those reins again. And we're sort of, I wouldn't say in a similar place, but in a similar trajectory as we were at the time.
All right. So as of this recording, which is in March 2020, and by the time this comes out, I'm sure listeners and viewers would have seen a interesting progress of how things played out since then. You have written a book that provides a how-to guide for building startups from the ground up. And part of the reason I think we spent a little bit of time around the kind of 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000, and the 2020s, is because it just shows you how dynamic things are. And the best practices of yore doesn't necessarily apply today, but there are some core principles that are still applicable. Tell us about the book. What are the takeaways and what can we learn and apply?
Well, the book is for first-time entrepreneurs, and it's really targeted at helping people decide if they should be an entrepreneur, what it means to be an entrepreneur, how do you create and build a successful startup from soup to nuts. Companies, people forget, and entrepreneurs certainly forget, that 9 out of every 10 companies fail. And we think they fail primarily because of lack of wisdom. There's a lot of knowledge in the water. There are a lot of people out there who profess that they know the secret to make things work. There's a lot of people who are happy to tell you why they were success. But we don't think we think most of those people actually have never done it before. And we don't think people convey wisdom very well. And that's not only in success, but in failure. And what my co-author and I have done, my co-author Rajat Bhargava and I have done here is we've compiled everything we've learned along the way, with everything we've learned from companies we've worked with, hundreds of companies we worked with, to sort of create a map of the things to avoid, things to do in an easy to read form, so that we convey wisdom. And the idea is to put the odds, to increase the odds of success, to move things in the entrepreneur's favor. So it teaches how to be an entrepreneur, what are the right things to do to start and build a company, and how ultimately to capitalize on early success.
Can you share with us a few examples of the do's and the don'ts?
Yes, definitely. One of the main concepts of the book is that we think that in the startup world now, everybody is saying you got to move fast, and speed is what is everything that matters. And while we certainly agree that getting to your end point as fast as possible is important, and that is getting good product or good service into the customer's hand as quickly as possible is absolutely crucial to the business, that doesn't mean that every step that you take along the way needs to be done as fast as possible. And we in fact think that's a huge error that companies make. We think that you actually should start slow to go fast. And what we mean by that is if you spend time to diligently vet your idea early on, that is, get to product market fit as early as you possibly can, understand whether you can build a team or not, understand whether you can create a sales channel that your customers will respond to, understand that you can price the product correctly along the way, you can fund your company and you can make money, and understand all of those things early in the cycle, then you'll actually get through to the customer and through to a better product and more profitability much faster. And along the way, you'll require less money to do it. You'll keep more of your company. You'll spend less time going out for venture capital. It's just super important and goes against what most of the advisors, I use air quotes here, will tell startups, will tell entrepreneurs on how to build a startup.
I really like that advice. As a matter of fact, that's a topic that I wanted to expand on Forbes, as well as in my university teaching as well, is that notion of market fit. And I think when investors provide capital to startups, they're not really betting on necessarily that particular idea, but rather the number of iterations to get to market fit, right? And I think the fact that they spent the time to talk with the actual purchasers of the products and services really make sure that they understood that, hey, this is going to be a sustainable market fit, a true long-term market fit. And they vet that out early, means that they're going to burn through cash more efficiently later on.
That's
so
right.
I really think that's great advice. Can you share one more advice, and then maybe I'll go ahead and wrap it up for today?
Sure. Well, I mean, one of the things that we feel very religious about is the idea of co-CEOs. We see this all the time, that a group of founders get together and they really can't decide who's going to run the company, and what founders don't often, what entrepreneurs often don't realize, is that this is not only an issue because you need one person in charge, and fundamentally, management works better with one person in charge, but it also is a huge red flag to anybody investing in the company, that the founders can't actually decide who is going to lead, which is indicative of poor decision making now and in the future. So just the fact that you enter the funding process with co-CEOs sends a signal that you're not worthy of investment. And that's why you see so many companies with that start with co-CEOs struggle to raise money.
Now, how does that work for publicly traded companies where they have co-CEOs?
Well, very few publicly traded companies have co-CEOs. It's once in a while you get it, but more often you get a breakdown where somebody is chairman of the board and another one is the CEO, or one is an executive chairman and one is CEO, or one is CEO and one is president, and then there are some functional differences in there.
All right. So my last question for you is, in your years of investing as an angel investor, um, what is kind of maybe a failure or maybe something that didn't quite work out that was a tremendous insight and a lesson learned that you want to be able to share with others?
I don't actually look at any negative experience I've had as a failure per se. I'm not that guy. I tend to be fairly ignorant of mistakes. I just plow through, and whether that's just a genetic problem that I have, I don't have the genes that caution me against those things, or just a behavioral issue that I have to deal with. It's how I've always dealt with things. But I will bring up one it's one I question every day in terms of the advice I give to companies moving forward here. When we bought ViewLogic back from its acquirer in the late 90s, when we did the management buyout that I mentioned before, we subsequently went public through what's called a reverse acquisition of a public company. So we acquired an existing public company. They were smaller than us, but they were public, and as a result, we became public. And as part of that move, we changed the name of the company and to form this merged entity. And what we did in doing that was we got this fresh new look, but at the same time, we abandoned all the branding and marketing effort we had put into the company for 10 years. And it seemed like a great idea at the time, but looking back, it was really stupid. I mean, just tremendously stupid that we did that. Now, did it hurt us success-wise? I mean, we were still a pretty successful company. The question is, could we have been more successful? I mean, you put so much energy into creating a brand and a reputation, to throw it away with a single swipe of a name change, that was not the smartest thing I've ever done.
Well, so thank you for that advice. So on that note, we've been joined by Will Herman, who's an entrepreneur, angel investor, and the author of the Startup Playbook. Thanks for joining today.
Thanks so much, Scott. I really appreciate the time.